Hey guys, welcome to chapter 11. In this chapter we're going to be talking about statistics and statistical studies throughout this whole chapter. And we're starting in this section talking about designing a study. What does it mean for a statistical study to be well designed? How do we avoid bias? What are the different types of studies that we can do? And we're going to talk about, again, good design of statistical studies. There's a lot of new vocabulary, or you might have heard some of it before, but there's a lot of vocabulary in this section, so please make sure that at the end of the video go back and make sure you know what each of these words means. They'll be showing up at different points throughout the video. So we're going to start. Our first goal is to be able to classify different studies by their types. So basically when I do a statistical study, what I'm doing is I'm going to collect some data, and I'm going to be investigating questions about a certain population characteristic, or another word for that is parameter. So a parameter is a population characteristic. Of course, sometimes there are constraints or restrictions on time and money. I might not be able to collect data from every member of a population. For example, if I want to do a study in Bogota, it's probably going to be impossible for me to talk to every person in Bogota. So a lot of times we do a sample. We take a sample of the population, and then we try to make our sample as well-rounded as possible. And then we calculate something called a statistic. A statistic is a number or something like that that we calculate or that we measure based on a sample. And then that sample statistic, some examples of one we do before would be mean or standard deviation. And I use that to make inferences or observations about the population parameter. The parameter, remember, is the characteristic that I'm investigating. So the steps in a typical study would be to identify the objective. What is the point of my study? What's my goal? I have to choose a sample and figure out how to actually get my data. I have to organize the data, and then I have to calculate my statistics. And then from those statistics, I can make conclusions, inferences, and other observations about the population, and maybe be able to try to make some predictions depending on the kind of statistics I use. If I want to have good information, which hopefully is the goal of your statistical study, and I want my conclusions to be accurate, which again is hopefully the goal of your statistical study, it's important that your sample is unbiased. Okay, when I say bias, I'm talking about an error that comes when I'm misrepresenting a population by choosing a sample poorly. For example, if I want to know how the people in Bogota feel about movies, and I only interview the people that walk out of a Marvel movie and ask them what their favorite kind of movie is, I have a biased sample because I've already chosen a group of people that is coming specifically out of an action movie. So if I choose my sample poorly, my results will not be accurate, and I won't be able to use them to make inferences or to make predictions. To reduce getting a biased sample, we often do something that's called a random sample, where I select people by chance. So I'm randomly selecting people to make sure that I get a wide variety and a wide range of opinions, or that I'm representing every part of my sample well. What we don't want to do is misrepresent a population by having a biased sample in our study. All right, so here are the different study types that could be possible. We have surveys. In a survey, I collect data from responses that I take from a population. You guys have done surveys a lot in your life, I'm sure, regarding characteristics, behaviors, or opinions. So I send someone a survey, they answer it, they send it back. An example would be if we wanted to determine whether our student body likes the new cafeteria menu. Stuco could ask a random sample of students their opinion. An experiment is a little bit more formal than a survey in some ways. In an experiment, I take my sample, the people or the group that I'm talking to, and I divide it into two different groups. I have what's called an experimental group. That's the one that I'm going to do something to that group. I'm going to make a change, or I'm going to try my new technique that I want to know about. And then I have a control group that does not undergo the change. So the control group continues as normal, and the experimental group undergoes one change, and then I compare the effects of the two situations. So for example, if a restaurant wants to make meals with chicken instead of beef, They would randomly give half the group meals with chicken and the other half meals with beef. That would be the only change they would make. And then they could get their opinion on how they liked the meals. That's a pretty simple example of an experiment. Obviously, experiments can be more complicated or more intense than that, but that's just a simple example. In what we call an observational study, members of my sample are measured or observed without being affected. So I'm not making a change. I'm not doing anything with them. I'm not asking them to do anything. They're just being observed, just watching and seeing what's happening. So researchers, this would be an example, researchers at an electronics company observe a group of teenagers using different laptops, and they note their reactions. Okay, so they're just observing. They're not telling the group anything. They're just looking to see what's happening. All right, so let's practice classifying these study types. So determine whether the situation is a survey, an experiment, or an observational study. Then they want you to identify the sample and suggest a possible population that they might have taken it from. So the first one is movies. A retro movie theater wants to determine what genre of movies to play in the next year. They plan to poll 50 random area residents and ask them what their favorite movies are. So this would be a survey because the data are collected from participants' responses. They're taking a poll. The sample is the 50 people, area residents that are polled, the 50 random area residents. And the population would be all area residents. So we can't talk to all of the population. We can't talk to everyone who lives in the area. So that's our population, and our sample is taken from that population. Our sample is the 50 people. All right, same question, this time with a driving scenario. A driving school wants to determine the main issue that drivers face while taking the driving test. They watch and record 30 random people taking the test. So this would be an observational study because they're just watching and observing. The drivers are not being affected at all. The sample is the 30 drivers that they chose. The population is all the drivers that would be taking the test. Not all drivers, but all drivers taking the test. All right, so you guys try this one. Which kind of study is it? Okay, this one is an experiment because we're providing a new entree to 30 randomly selected tasters and observing their reactions. So they are undergoing a change. They're getting a new entree. The other tasters are not getting a new entree, so this would be an experiment. All right, choose a study type. Determine whether the situation calls for a survey, experiment, or observational study. So this time, you're deciding which kind of study would be appropriate, and then you need to explain. So, video games. A gaming company plans to test whether a new controller is preferable to the old one. A group of teens will be observed while using the controllers to see which one they use the most. All right. Since they're going to be observed, it seems like an observational study would be the most obvious answer. All right, part B. Restaurants. A restaurant wants to conduct an online study where they will ask customers whether they were satisfied with their dining experience. That sounds like a survey because members of the sample population will be asked for their opinion. Okay, try this one. All right, in this case, an experiment makes the most sense because we want to make a change. There's a new health drink that they want to try, right? So we would take a sample. Half of our sample would continue with the same drink, half would get the new drink, and then they would experiment or see which one gave the better result or what their opinions were. All right, designing studies. After I decide what kind of study I want, I have to figure out what kind of questions I'm going to choose, and I have to figure out how to make my study appropriate or effective. The questions can introduce bias, so I have to be careful to ask good questions. I don't want to say something like, you like action movies the best, right? You want to ask neutral questions that will not affect the results. Poorly written survey questions, for example, can really affect your data, and they would give you information that would not be helpful. So you need your questions to be clear and precise, and you need to avoid survey questions that are confusing or too wordy. If they're too hard to understand, you won't get accurate data. Cause a strong reaction, so you want your questions to be as neutral as possible. Encourage a certain response. Again, you want your questions to be neutral. You don't want them to push people toward one direction or another. And you need each question to only address one issue. If your question addresses more than one issue, it can be confusing because you don't know if their answer, which part that they would be answering. You also have to make sure you have enough information that they can answer accurately. Okay, so let's take a look at example 3. Determine whether this question would be biased or unbiased. And then you need to explain your reasoning. So, what is your favorite type of music? This would be an unbiased question. It's clear. It's not encouraging a certain response. It's a neutral question. All you have to do is answer. What about this one? Do you think that poisons, such as pesticides, should be sprayed on crops? This question could be biased because they've used that term poison. So they're already using a term with a negative connotation. It'd probably be better to say something like, do you think that pesticides should be sprayed on crops? And just leave it at that. And then it's up to the person to decide if they think it's poison or not. All right, so try this one. This one would be biased, mostly because of this part right here. It says, are you planning on watching the ultimate sporting event? So they're already guiding you towards a certain response by saying, the Super Bowl is the best sporting event. Aren't you going to watch it? Instead of just saying, are you planning on watching the Super Bowl? Okay, make sure, again, this is going back to the beginning, but when you design a survey or any sort of a study, you need to state your objective clearly, know what your population is, and then you have to choose unbiased survey questions. So here, a community college wants to determine whether college-bound students from local high schools would be interested, it should say interested, in taking a class at the college. State the objective, suggest a population, and then we would want 2 unbiased survey questions. So our objective here is to determine whether students that are planning on going to college would be interested in taking a class at the community college. That's the purpose or the objective of the study. My population, which they're showing me here, all local high school students, and they're interested in all of the local high school students in their area. They probably wouldn't be able to talk to all of them, so they would choose a sample. Here are some sample survey questions. Are you planning on attending college after high school? Would you be interested in taking a course at the community college during high school? Those would be 2 examples. You could probably think of different ones. All right, check your progress with this one. So this would be an example of 2 unbiased survey questions. Would it be beneficial? That's just your opinion. How often would you use it? Again, just your opinion or your statement. For example, in part A, it says, would it be beneficial? But the second question is leading you towards a certain answer. Wouldn't employees be less productive? Wouldn't employees be happier? Wouldn't it interfere with work? It's leading you towards a certain answer. Part B is the one with both questions being more neutral. In order to avoid introducing bias into our experiments, if I'm talking about an experiment now instead of a survey, I should make sure that I randomly select my experimental and control groups. So if I have my sample, I'm going to randomly put people in either the experimental or the control group. And everything about the 2 groups should be alike except for the one thing that you're changing, which is the treatment or the procedure. So do you see a flaw in this experiment? A research company wants to conduct a study to determine whether a new fishing reel is more effective than the old reel. The experimental procedure consists of using the new reel to catch fish in one lake and using the old reel to catch fish in another nearby lake that is randomly chosen. And then the results were the company said, okay, well, the new reel is twice as effective as the old reel. Can you find any issues with this experiment? The flaw is that we use 2 different lakes. What they want to know is the difference between the reels, but they have different reels and different lakes. So we don't know if the amount of fish in the 2 lakes is the same to make sure that my experiment is controlled. The results might have been affected by the different lakes instead of by the different fishing reels. All right, try this one. Okay, in this case, the answer would be B. They should compare the scores of a group using the new ball with scores of the same group using a different ball. That would make it a better experiment. All right, last one. Here, we're stating the objective, suggesting a population, figuring out our experimental and controlled groups, and describing a sample procedure. So take a second to read through what they have here and make sure you write it down on your notes.